Hello, advanced political economy students. Welcome back to Poverty to Prosperity. This week we're talking about conflict economies or the economy of conflict. And you'll see why I'm not certain exactly which word to put first, because we have a mutually constitutive relationship between economic conditions and rates of violence and other forms of conflict in society. So, per usual, today we're going to focus on Africa, but a lot of the lessons that we're talking about today travel really well to any least developing country or global south country, whichever term you prefer. And they apply to a lot of what we saw at the end of communism in Eastern and Central Europe, and they're highly portable. So we're going to talk about African cases today, but remember, most of what we talk about travels really well. So each week we try to focus on one driving question. And so this week, the overarching question for us to keep in mind is, to what degree are conflicts a function of economics? And we talked earlier in this term about relationships between variables and the difference between correlation and causation, and what reverse causality means and what omitted variable bias means. So when you ask a question, what is the function of, you're leaving the answer to be open to either direction of causality or correlation or any other sort of relationship. So you're leaving the question really open. To what degree are conflicts a function of economics, or are economics a function of conflict? So as you saw on Canvas and also on our shared Google Drive, we had two really helpful readings on basically conflict economies, and one of them was by Goodhand and one of them was on Marx. And the questions that I will put up in our Canvas discussion for you to answer are whether poverty causes conflict or conflict causes poverty, which drives which. And then the second enduring question in peace and conflict studies is what's called the greed or grievance debate. So historically, we would think that conflicts were very ideologically driven. And you see this a lot during the Cold War, right? So most conflicts throughout the 20th century were really about East versus West, capitalism versus communism, or capitalism versus socialism. And there was this idea that they were really ideologically driven. And we see the same historically when we look at religious conflicts. Some political scientists like to think, have argued that religion does not cause conflict, but is simply an organizing principle. That's the word, an organizing principle. But then a debate came about with around 2000, the seminal piece on this debate about does grievance or does greed, right? Do unhappy people start conflicts, or do greedy people start conflicts? Really took off in around 2000 when Collier and Hoffler published a study, I think funded by the World Bank. And they found that greed is more likely to inspire a conflict, and that most conflicts, even when they're framed as ideological or based on grievance, actually at their root have money or other material resources as the driver behind the conflict. So at this point, we tend to believe that probably greed is more of a driver, but I don't think it's necessarily a clean binary, and that we need to create a binary, right? Conflict is messy, which is what you're about to hear about for the next hour. So per usual, I want us to touch base and talk about some really important vocabulary words and concepts in peace and conflict studies and political economy to help us understand these drivers. The first actually comes traditionally from the field of economics, which is opportunity costs. And the opportunity cost of any person's decision is the loss of other alternatives when that one decision is chosen. So if you as an individual choose A over B, the opportunity cost is the benefits of B that you have lost out on. And this is a really important term when we think about what causes conflicts and also economic incentives, right? Because we typically think that anyone, I would say a traditional economist will tell you that people tend to join insurgencies, implement coups, and engage in violence when for them, there's not a great opportunity cost for not doing so. And a great case of this is when I was working in Nigeria, there was a program of amnesty for Niger Delta oil militants, and it was a job training program. And so the idea is if you offer these militants or insurgents, there's a lot of baggage around which word you choose. They would call themselves freedom fighters, right? If you offer them jobs, perhaps that is their option B to fighting. And then if they think they can get employed, the opportunity cost for joining an insurgency would be too high. So this is the idea that people who engage in violence do an opportunity cost in their head, like a cost benefit analysis. The second important term that we're going to talk about is horizontal inequalities. And you see this term on our shared Google Drive. I put a supplement for 4 case studies of what you can consider to be the types. It would be like a typology of conflict. There's 4 types of conflict in those case studies on our Google Drive. And one of them is about horizontal inequalities. And horizontal inequalities are the inequities that we see among individuals within the same social group. So a vertical inequality would be a wild income gap between group A and group B based on ethnicity, nationality, race, religion, whatever their differences is. Horizontal inequality is when people within the same group, the same ethnicity, the same race, the same religion, have wildly different outcomes, say in amount of income as well. So we want to think about inequalities between groups, and we want to think about inequalities within groups or intra-group inequality. Then I'm going to be using the term this week, hybrid conflicts. And here's where that term comes from. So throughout the 20th century, traditionally, when you think of conflicts, you think of soldiers in uniform fighting other soldiers in uniform because the executive branch of their government or their own military sent them out there. You have military conflicts, and these are formal, they're clear, everyone's incentive is clear. That's what we think about in terms of traditional conflicts. However, towards the end of the Cold War, circa 1989, and then definitely in the 1990s, specifically in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, these countries give me the most prime example of conflicts that arise not between soldiers, not between countries, not by soldiers who are well trained and wearing uniforms. All of that traditional form of conflict comes out the window. And you have civilians picking up arms and they're fighting other civilians. And oftentimes the government isn't even privy to what these actors are doing. And it becomes very messy and the conflict becomes very decentralized. It's no longer side A and side B. It's very fluid, it's very flexible, and the lines are not quite so clear. So a hybrid conflict is a conflict with an interconnected group of state and non-state actors pursuing overlapping goals. So maybe soldiers are involved, maybe civilians are involved. Most of the time, they're both involved at the same time. And while this is going on, there's a very weak state in power, meaning the government is not in control. So here's what I want to remind you of. I believe a few weeks ago, I clarified that a helpful way to define a state, and remember, a state is the political science term for what we commonly talk about as a government, but state is a more accurate term. can be defined by three ways. One is the ability to levy taxes. Two is the ability to create security forces to protect that state. And three is the ability to delineate the geographic borders of that country. This is my border, this is your border, and that establishes sovereignty. So when I say weak state, I mean a government that probably does not have a strong government security apparatus. Maybe their borders are really fluid and populations are moving back and forth, or they're unclear. And the state is not in a position to be collecting taxes fairly and putting those towards social services. It's not performing what we call state-like functions. So a hybrid conflict involves state and non-state actors. It's not a clear binary. Lots of people have different incentives and engage in different behaviors for different ways, and it's fluid. And typically it means the government is not governing very well, which is why this hybrid conflict can take place. So post 1989 in Africa, I would like for you to really consider the idea that many, if not most, conflicts in Africa after this period are hybrid conflicts. And this can be juxtaposed with the more traditional conflicts that you had against colonial occupation or during the Cold War. Okay. And then the fourth term is the conflict trap, which is pretty self-explanatory, but there is evidence indicating that once a country experiences a conflict, it will be far more likely to experience a conflict again, both sooner in time than it otherwise would have, and to a greater degree than it otherwise would have. So having a conflict today increases a country's probability of having a conflict again in the next 5, certainly within the next 10 years. And this has been empirically demonstrated. And once you're in that conflict, it's really difficult to get out of it, and it becomes a negative feedback loop or a trap, right? So if you have violence left and right, how can people go to work? But if people can't go to work, they can't earn an income. And if they don't have an income, they might have a reason to engage in criminal behaviors to try to secure resources. And those criminal behaviors will take the form of conflict, right? So there we have this trap. So it's like, do you help raise people's income, or do you implement peace first? Where do you stop the cycle? And then the last term is about spillover or neighborhood effects. And this has been fairly well documented, specifically among quantitative political scientists. And that is the finding indicating that if country A experiences a conflict, even if nothing by country B next door changes, just by virtue of country A's conflict, country B is more likely to have its own conflict, even if nothing in country B has changed. Again, the West African civil wars of the 1990s are great examples. If you look at the spillover effect between Liberia and Sierra Leone, that's a great example. So these spillover effects happen for a couple of reasons: migration and refugee flows, the movement of armed actors across borders, the transport of natural resources across borders. And there is the term in political science is an incentive to capture the state. So if country B is using all of its resources to stop the conflict from country A coming over its borders, that's time, energy, money, and resources that it's not using on other forms of security, which could increase the likelihood that someone could try to capture the state or implement a coup. That's money that country B is not spending on its police force and its judicial system and all the other things that help keep a country stable, right? So a neighboring conflict sucks away resources from the way that they otherwise would be spent for positive peace. All right. I love all this stuff. I hope I'm being contagious. So, you know what? Let me close off my camera because I think it blocks it blocks your view. Sorry, you don't need to see me. So I'm going to paint some very broad brushstrokes, which, and as you know, I try to be really careful in doing that. And if I'm painting broad brushstrokes, I want to let you know that I'm doing so, and that the purpose of me doing so is to simplify some really big ideas. But so my broad brushstrokes are this. The enduring debate is about whether poverty causes conflict or conflict causes poverty. So on the one hand, there are some people who say that they're just not related. And the reason they say some of these things is because there are plenty of poor countries that do not have conflicts. North Korea, Equatorial Guinea. But you'll notice that these impoverished countries that don't have conflicts are also dictatorships in which power is centrally located, and that has to balance out. For me, that balances out poverty as a driver for the conflict. Is a very strong centralized state that represses any sort of social movement or pushback or anything like that. Then there's also the idea that poverty is what we would call a necessary condition for conflict, and that when you combine that poverty with grievance, grievance must also be a necessary precondition, then you get conflict. So the idea is you need both poverty and inequality or grievance together as an equation to make a conflict. The second school of thought is that the reverse, that it's actually conflict that causes the poverty, not the other way around. So there's plenty of evidence indicating that when countries go to war or have any sort of war, businesses are not able to function. The country doesn't have as open trade with neighbors, so it's difficult to import and export goods. Conflict creates a disincentive for foreign companies or foreign countries to invest in a country. So foreign investment gets stymied. And so when you put all of these things together, this conflict creates the poverty. So that's the reverse. In the 4 case studies that are on the Google Drive, this is not comprehensive, but these are the 4 dominant theories that I think I run up against in my reading on a regular basis. So the first is about resource scarcity, and that is the idea that not enough resources for too many people causes a conflict. Then there's the idea of private motivation. That's about individual greed. Then there's the idea of group motivation, that only when individuals get together can a conflict arise. And then there's the idea of social contract failure. That's the idea that we give up some of our freedoms in exchange for our government protecting us. And when our government doesn't protect us, then you have social contract failure and you have an incentive to engage in conflict. So this first idea, poverty causes conflict, it offers no reason, when there's poverty, there's no reason to end a conflict. So we know there's evidence that poverty can prolong the duration of a conflict. So poverty can cause a conflict to begin with, and it makes it last longer. One of the other explanations is that poverty is typically always part and parcel with low education levels. And we do know that people having low education levels increases the likelihood of a conflict. We also know that people being unemployed increases the likelihood of a conflict, largely because of the opportunity cost example I gave you. Poor people, the other idea behind this, that poverty causes conflict, is that people living below the poverty line can't pay those taxes that fund government security, right? Poor people can't pay taxes, and those taxes can't be used to pay for police and soldiers that would otherwise stabilize peace. And poverty creates economic migrants, and economic migrants create conflict. A great example of this is actually Central Asia. So Uzbekistan is one of the poorer countries in Central Asia. And so now there's a lot of tensions and conflicts as Uzbeki farmers are coming into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, looking for grasses and water sources for their animals. And then that's an example of poverty driving cross-border migration, which drives conflict. So in our discussion on Canvas, I will have all of you provide a case study example of any of these. So this case study example can be from your home country. For those of you who are fortunate enough to be from a home country that has a relatively low rate of conflict, I know there's some folks in our class from Namibia and Botswana and some other countries where they might not have good examples. You're welcome to give an example from any country, really anywhere in the world if you would like, of how you can see that poverty can cause conflict for any of these reasons. Or the reverse, conflict can cause poverty. So there are plenty of countries that have fallen into conflict when they were doing relatively well economically. You see that in a lot of the darlings of Africa, right? There was a time when Burundi had a higher GDP than Rwanda. And now look at the difference between those two countries, right? So the idea behind this explanation is that government funding goes to war rather than social services, which I already alluded to. Infrastructure is destroyed in fighting. So a great quintessential example is that when fighters destroy a bridge or a road, then goods can no longer be transported along that route, which would minimize the amount of trade and stymie economic activities. People must fight rather than work for income. So this is an issue of time. So if there's only so many hours per day that a person can be engaged in lucrative activity, right? So if a person is fighting, that's time that they're not tending to their small business. But also that's time that they're not learning professional skills that would help them earn an income, right? So if you're busy in a firefight, you're not working on professional skills that could help you improve your income in the future. This conflict creates forced migrants. This conflict creates health problems and injuries that require money. So this is kind of twofold, right? So conflict, it actually injures those who are fighting and the victims of the fighting. But also conflict is likely to close down hospitals. Conflict is likely to keep healthcare professionals at home rather than have them go to work if they feel that going to work is too dangerous. Conflict is likely to shut down the routes that are necessary to distribute medicine and medical supplies. So there's so many secondary health problems to conflict. So for example, we know that during the West African civil wars that are in our case studies, that maternal and infant mortality rates skyrocketed when the RUF took over Sierra Leone. And that's because there's no resources or human capital to go help women give birth safely when you're in the middle of a civil war, right? Then conflict impedes access to education, and on many levels, education is an incentive to avoid conflict. And also, schools are a really important place for socialization and to teach us peaceful conflict management and to teach us all of the other quote unquote soft skills. I don't like that term. The soft skills that we use for peaceful conflict resolution, right? So this is multifaceted. So there is a video that I'm going to show you very briefly.
For a decade after the end of the Cold War, the world experienced a dramatic decline in the incidence and deadliness of armed conflict, particularly in Africa. If we take population size into account, sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East carry the largest conflict burden. Most of this violence occurs within and not between countries. 7 relationships explain the relatively high levels of internal armed conflict in Africa. The first is poverty. Internal armed violence is more frequent in poorer than in wealthier countries. More than 1/3 of Africa's population still lives in extreme poverty. Poverty is exacerbated by inequality, and inequality fuels violence. Transitions from autocracy to democracy or adverse regime changes are often prone to violence. A large democratic deficit translates into a risk of instability. In the Arab Spring countries, citizens' demand for democracy was vastly at odds with the actual supply. Africa's population is young. This is an advantage. But if young people lack opportunities and rates of urbanization are high, the risk of conflict increases. Once a country has experienced large-scale violence, the tendency towards repeat violence is strong. Being located in a conflict-ridden neighborhood increases the risk of experiencing instability. Rising global inequality and transnational terrorism add to the internal and regional drivers of conflict in Africa. Looking longer term, we also expect resource competition at a local level to trigger violence. Since 2010, violence in Africa has been on the rise. Contemporary African conflicts are increasingly fragmented, fought on a smaller scale and on the peripheries of states. More non-state actors are involved and insurgents are often divided. The spread of transnational organized crime, including terrorism, is often linked with local politics and criminal dynamics. Lower intensity conflict is becoming more prevalent, and since 2011, there has been a rise in social conflict, especially anti-government violence. Violence related to elections has also increased. Strong democracies are generally associated with greater peace, but democratization can trigger violence in the short and medium term. Violence at a community level has also increased. People compete over scarce livelihood resources such as land and water. The impact of climate change will aggravate this trend. Most conflicts include elements of support from neighboring countries, as borders are not controlled and rural areas not policed. The generally positive development outlook for Africa presents an unprecedented opportunity to ensure greater peace. Africa is likely to grow at an average annual rate of around 6% over the next 15 years, and incomes will continue to rise. This will steadily chip away at the structural drivers of conflict. As national incomes increase, states have more resources to deter, stop, and prevent violence. Africans have an opportunity to shape their own future, but the quality and nature of governance is key. Poor governance, marginalization, lack of voice and accountability cut across many of the current conflict dynamics in Africa. We need to focus on building security, capacity, and inclusion at all levels in our societies. To make development, stability, and peace a reality in Africa will require concerted effort at national, regional, and continental levels, as well as the support of the United Nations. Connect with us online.
So this debate about, I guess, what causes wars brings us now to this discussion of, does the cause of war depend on the type of war? So as I mentioned, we are beyond an age, especially in the age of the internet. So much now of conflict takes place online. Either online activity drives the initial conflict, or it creates the environment or the context for which a conflict can take root. Or, cyber warfare arguably is becoming the most dangerous threat and the greatest form of violence in the 20th century, right? So it brings us to this idea of hybrid wars. And hybrid wars put into question, who are the actors involved? What are their incentives? And what are their tactics and their strategies? And these new or hybrid conflicts, they were first conceived of by Mary Calder, if you want to look up her book. The book review is actually on our Google Drive. These hybrid conflicts have four defining dimensions. The first is that they involve many non-state actors, not trained soldiers. B, they're based on identity more than ideology. So when we talk about ideology, so this definition, it gets a little dicey because oftentimes identity and ideology are intertwined, right? Specifically when you're talking about religious identity, right? A religious identity is a form of ideology, right? But sometimes in this sense, identity can also just be based on ethnicity or race or nationality. And those are identity markers more than they are ideology markers, right? Third, hybrid conflicts have used fear to garner political control. So it's about being able to control people's minds, fears, and anxieties as much as it is about controlling actual resources. And hybrid conflicts have been financed through predation rather than taxes. So in a traditional war, the government collects taxes from the people and then uses those taxes to pay for the military, to pay for its war. However, if you have a hybrid conflict that's not being funded by the government, the leaders of that conflict have to make their money in other ways. And this can come from stealing. This can come from looting. This can come from increasingly, as we see in the Central American gang wars, human trafficking. This can come from buying and selling drugs, which we see in Guinea. So there's lots of ways for armed actors to make their own money, frankly, that's more lucrative even than a government collecting taxes. So in short, modern conflicts, especially in developing countries, can often be partially explained along these lines of the hybrid conflict. And now to the four types of conflict, which are in your case studies on Google Drive. The first is the resource explanation or the scarcity explanation. And if you need to do further research, you can also Google the Green War hypothesis. And the best single book chapter that I found on this that I really enjoyed was actually written by an anthropologist, Jared Diamond. And in chapter 7 of the book Collapse, he hypothesizes that the genocide against the Tutsis was driven by resource scarcity, by really high population numbers and relatively little land. However, as we know, there are lots of drivers for the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. It's very, very complex. He just has one particular view of it. It is not a complete explanation, but that is an example of the Green War hypothesis at work. And the Green War hypothesis also says that as climate change diminishes the amount of environmental resources available, especially in rural areas, to people below the poverty line, diminishing resources due to climate change will drive up conflict even more. Rising populations, in contrast to agricultural productivity, just creates an imbalance of the proportion of resources per people. Good case studies of this are Rwanda, Kyrgyzstan, and Sudan. In the Sudan, we see how desertification, which is the drying up of formerly arid lands because of climate change, are driving livestock owning communities to go to new areas that they haven't been to before, and it's causing rural conflict. Private motivation is part of this greed hypothesis that says that young, uneducated we try to be feminist in our course and gender inclusive and gender neutral, but the results show that it really is only young men. It's not common for groups of young women to take up arms by private motivation to gain work as fighters. Although I do want to add, there is ample research on the role of good girl soldiers in hybrid wars. I wrote my master's thesis on it, actually, and all the roles that women play in war, which tend to not typically be armed, with some exceptions, right? There is a lot of armed female fighters among the Tamil Tigers and among the Kurdish Liberation Army in Turkey, but other than that, women's role in conflict tends to be in support roles, portering, cooking, cleaning, engaging in espionage, and other forms of indirect engagement. And under the private motivation explanation, conflict creates opportunities to loot. That should be to raid, steal, aid, and sell drugs and weapons and other commodities, basically to engage in criminal activities. And case studies might be Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Somalia. When I'm talking about Somalia, I'm also, some of you might be aware of the piracy issues that Somalia is trying to get under control along its coasts. And that's a good example of private motivation. Group motivation is when all the individuals from B come together. So horizontal inequalities, intra-group inequalities create the conditions and grievances that inspire groups to work in tandem to improve their outcomes through conflict. Only group dynamics can create violence. Social tensions are more than a necessary precondition. So this basically says without group organization, conflicts cannot exist. That's a good way to put it. Without group organization, conflicts cannot exist. And we see this in Liberia, Rwanda, and South Africa. And the last one, social contract failure draws a little bit on political philosophy. So if any of you have ever taken political philosophy, the Hobbesian social contract theory, pardon me, John Locke, Hobbes is the one who said that life is short and dark and miserable. Social contract was developed by John Locke, an Enlightenment thinker, that basically said the reason that government exists is to protect us and give us shared services and make our life better than it would be if we tried to live on our own without governments. But in turn, because we give up some of our rights and freedoms and our taxes to our governments, they have a duty to us as well. So it's an exchange. We give up freedoms and our taxes in exchange for protection and safety and a better life that a government can give us. So when this contract fails, we can see that social stability is based on the social contract between people and the government. And the idea is that we accept government's authority as a trade for protection and services. And when we don't have desirable economic outputs or social services, the contract breaks and people feel that they no longer have to obey the law, that they can't rely on the government for their well-being, and they are going to try to function as if the government is not there. So case studies might include Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Burundi. And in your case study documents, I talked a little bit about the Niger Delta oil conflict, and I framed that as social contract failure. So when oil was first discovered in Nigeria in 1959, the idea was that all of this oil was going to make Nigerians rich people. And then it clearly did not. And poverty rates today in the Niger Delta are actually higher than they were in 1960. So not only have people not become rich, they've actually become poorer. So with that, you have this idea that the government is not doing what it's supposed to do to enrich the lives of people living on oil lands. So as a response, insurgents are taking up arms because they feel that there has been social contract failure. So because we are grand thinkers, grand problem solvers, and leaders, we're going to engage in some moonshot thinking. and with some 3 responses. So here are the questions for us to consider is how do we break this cycle of the conflict trap, which has plagued a lot of African countries. So in the policy world, certainly, and I think also among researchers, there is this idea that we can take kind of 3 different approaches. The first can be thought of as working on conflict. Violence is on a spectrum, and we are just realistically trying to keep rates at the lower end. And these folks who believe in number 1 believe that we're never going to have a fully peaceful society, so it's much more realistic to simply try to do the best we can to minimize violence as much as possible. Folks in the second school believe in working in conflict from the inside and drawing on conflict dynamics and using them to end poverty and violence together. So these people in number 2 feel that poverty causes conflict and conflict causes poverty together. And if you solve one, it's just going to make, you can't solve one without solving the other, is their point. So you work on them in tandem. And then number 3 are the working around conflict folks. So these people feel that you don't need to directly try to end certainly armed conflict or armed violence, because it is simply a consequence of poor quality of life and poverty rates and lack of opportunity, essentially. So if you the people in number 3 believe if you make life better, the average person who is engaging in violence will voluntarily give that up because they just want a stable life with positive outcomes. So you can choose if you believe in 1, 2, or 3. You can choose to believe in a combination of 1, 2, and 3, or you can believe that 1, 2, and 3 are all off base. And as a leader, you can conceive of your 4th or your 5th responses to how to avoid the conflict trap. So for our purposes, we need to consider which of these is best for Africa, or which of these are best for particular African countries. And does a country's economic conditions, demographic makeup, geography, does that make a difference whether or not 1, 2, or 3 are going to be useful? I would love it if you would think about what this means for your own African country. Okay, I'll let that simmer. I've noticed in my conversations in office hours and just with my undergraduates over the years, some common misunderstandings about what the research on war, conflict, and peace building tells us. So these 6 bullet points are what I would consider the 6 most common misnomers that I often have to clarify for my students. And the first myth is that countries go to war with other countries. And yes, this happens, of course. But as we heard in our discussion of hybrid wars, this is increasingly less common. And if you'd like an interesting idea to chew on, there is something called democratic peace theory, which finds that never in history have 2 democracies ever gone to war with each other. Think about that. And if you can find an exception, I would love to hear it. Also, we know that most fighters today are not trained soldiers. So there is this myth of the uniformed trained soldier with government issued weapons. Those soldiers are a minority, especially in Africa. We also need to keep in mind the prevalence of underage and child soldiers who are not adults. These are obviously most common in hybrid wars and civil wars. And one thing that I really struggle with is this arbitrary age of 18. As suddenly, if you're 18, then you're not a child soldier, but if you're 17 and a half, you are a child soldier. So I would also like to push back against this hard stop at the age of 18, determining who is an adult in war and who is not. There is some evidence indicating that poverty with stability may be good and instability with less poverty may be bad. Okay, this is what I mean by bullet point 4. Would you rather have to live on $2 a day in a country that was stable, had no invading forces, was not vulnerable to a civil war? Or would you rather make $5 or $10 a day in a country in which there was higher rates of crime, borders were very porous, perhaps the government was not great at implementing security measures, and you were less safe and less stable? This is a terrible choice to have to make. Most of us don't have to make this choice. The choice is made for us. But the point of this bullet point is that per capita income and GDP is not always the best determinant of well-being. It is very scary, even if you have more material resources, to live in a place that is unstable. So that's what we want to keep in mind. How much do we value stability and how much do we value economic outcomes? Fifth, one of my professors during my PhD, Leonard Wanchikon, said this once in a doctoral seminar, and I never forgot it because it was really transformative to me. And he essentially said, although conflict is not good, conflict can prevent good opportunities for rebuilding, was more or less the words he used. And his point was conflict should always be avoided, but if it does occur, the opportunity for doing better in a country in the future needs to be galvanized. And I think Rwanda is probably an excellent example of that. And then my last point is that there is no such thing as peace. So a few generations ago, we used to think that if there was violence and armed conflict and fighting, that was war. And as long as people weren't fighting, that was peace. We now have a concept of positive peace. And positive peace basically says not fighting isn't enough. A country and the world has to take proactive measures to improve people's well-being, health, livelihoods, and outcomes to actively build peace in a sustainable way to make our lives better. I repeat, not fighting does not equal peace anymore. That's not enough. We have to actively put in place the measures that improve people's outcomes. And the term is positive peace. That's really what we're going for. So that concludes our lesson on conflict economies. Thank you so much for engaging. I know hybrid and online learning is not easy, so I really, really appreciate your attention. And this recording and all of our videos will be available on Canvas. Thank you so much. Enjoy your weeks.